Mistakes Over Failure, where CEOs and board members from around the world share the good, the bad, and the ugly of their diversity and inclusion journeys. We are CEOs.
We understand the pressures of leadership and the rules that are often unwritten.
I'm Dr. Christine Crawford.
And I'm Leslie Wingo. Together, we're here to spark honest and frank conversations that will encourage us to think differently, learn from failures, avoid inaction, and encourage each of us to make mistakes.
The world needs better leaders, and we can become better together. Welcome to Mistakes Over Failure, where today we're joined by Jeff Small and Niyi Yusuf. Welcome. So if you all could please start by introducing yourselves. Jeff, if you could start, please.
Great. Well, thank you for having me on today. I'm Jeff Small. I am the co-founder and CEO of MDH Partners. We are an Atlanta-based real estate private equity firm, and we invest money on behalf of large nonprofit institutions like university endowments and foundations in real estate across the country. Since we're talking about kind of the effects of faith in our world and our business, I'm a lifelong Episcopalian, and I also hold a master's in religious studies from Oxford University in England.
All right, thanks, and nice to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Niyi Yusuf. I'm based out of Lagos in Nigeria. My background is computer science and worked as a management consultant with Attenderson with Accenture. In the last 5 years, retired. I'm working with my colleagues to support businesses in Africa. From a religious point of view, last 4.5 years, I've been the president of NASFAT. NASFAT is an Islamic society established from Lagos, but now with branches in quite many, these are about 4 continents. So glad to be here.
Well, thank you so much. We are both glad to help you. My name is Leslie Wingo. What we're going to do first, and what we start all our podcasts with our guests, is 6 rapid fire questions. So I think we will start with Niyi. We'll have you go first, and then Jeff will go over to you, right? So are you ready?
Ready.
Okay, shoot.
All right. So here's the first set of questions. Where are you from?
Africa.
Africa. What emoji do you use most often?
Namaste, that's a prayer hand.
What is your favorite book?
So 2 books. First is the Quran, and second is a 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey.
What was your first job?
Taking care of my sister.
Business acronyms, do you love them or hate them?
I love them.
What is your guilty pleasure?
Sleep. Sleeping beyond 6 hours.
I think that's a brilliant answer.
When I can.
When you can. Jeff, we're ready to start with you. So where are you from, Jeff?
I'm from Atlanta.
What emoji do you use most often?
Heart.
Your favorite book?
Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett.
Business acronyms, do you love them or do you hate them?
I hate them.
What is your guilty pleasure?
It's a toss-up between chocolate and a great bourbon.
Very nice. I would like for both of you to tell us about your leadership journey and how faith played a role in who you are and where you are today. So Jeff, why don't we start with you?
So I started out in a family business, my family business that I was working for my grandfather in the early 90s. And then as his health deteriorated, I took over the company and became a CEO at the very young age of 31, which is really too young to be running a large company. And my journey, having now been a CEO of a business for decades now, has really evolved. And it was, when I started out, I overvalued IQ versus EQ. I had degrees from Yale, Harvard, and Oxford. I was very impressed with my intelligence, my vision, my strategy, but I was weak on the emotional side, the empathy, the connecting with people on a non-intellectual level. And I assumed everyone should follow me because of the brilliance of my ideas. As I have matured over the last 30 years, and as my faith has really broadened my understanding, there's no question that today at 57, my mind isn't as sharp as it was when I was 27, but my EQ is so much better. And as I've learned to relate to people on a different emotional level rather than just an intellectual level. And that my faith has been a big part of that, of seeing people, as individuals with very different ideas, and to open my heart, not just my mind. And I'm a much stronger leader today because of that. Even though I think my IQ is less than it was 30 years ago, my EQ is much higher than it was. And part of that is just developing my faith and my own spirituality of understanding who I am as a person so that then I can understand others in a deeper way.
Thank you. Niyi, what about you? What has been your leadership journey, and how has faith played a role in where you are and who you are today?
All right. So, interesting question. So, I lost my dad at the age of 5. So I never really grew to know him. And I came from very humble means. And I have this single mom who took care of 4 of us, right? And I realized very quickly that progression will come from others and not necessarily from my mom or from my siblings who are all younger than me. And so I've been fortunate that my first job, career progression have been through friends of friends. People who didn't know me, yet who offered their shoulders for me to climb up. And that has influenced my own leadership journey. And so for me, it's clear that my role is to provide opportunities for others. My role is to achieve through others, not necessarily achieving through myself. And I have this, what I call my 5 C's that I typically use. First is around compassion. Second one is character. Got to be of good character, integrity, hardworking. Third is competence. So I look for people with the right skills. Fourth is contentment. I'm contented with what I have. And that is something spiritual. And the 5th is compassion. You've got to be compassionate for others. But the one that drives in the most is really around contentment. And there's one of the sayings of the prophet, what you call is hadith, that contentment is a treasure that can never end and a wealth that can never be exhausted. And so I take those 5 C's together to shape where I am and my leadership journey.
So, Niyi, Nigeria is, as far as I could tell, I think the only country that has both the largest populations of both Muslims and Christians. And I think by 2050, it's slated to have the largest number of members of both. It'd be number 3, right, in the world. So what does that look like in the workplace? And how, as business leaders, does that balance between being, both Muslim and Christian, what does that look like?
So you're right. Nigeria is almost 50-50 in terms of Muslims and Christians. But constitutionally, we say we're a secular country. So we don't talk religion, we don't discuss religion. But from a workplace point of view, we've got to provide opportunities for people to be themselves. And so, for instance, in my own office, Friday, we close early on Fridays so that the Muslims can go for Jumat prayer. That's the Friday prayers. We close early during the month so that the Muslims who are fasting can go home to fast early. We have a prayer room, sort of, where guys can pray. And it's a multi-religious prayer room. So the Christians can go in there, the Muslims can also go in there. And so forward-looking organizations will make such provisions. But I do know many organizations do not, because they will say that this is a workplace, not a religious place. And so they try to separate it. But increasingly for forward-looking organizations where you're trying to be the best you can in terms of creating the right environment, and you make some provisions and allowances.
Jeff, one of the things and the reason that I ended up hearing about you was you talk about leadership lessons from great faiths and have done a lot of academic work in this area. And so is there anything that you'd like to add about that idea of how faith is brought into the workplace, whether it is labeled such or not?
Yeah, I'm very careful about not labeling it as faith in the workplace because I think that immediately raises people's guards and suspicions up. As you mentioned, I mean, I look at myself as a perpetual student. And I'm a student of business, but I've been a student of world religions. And part of my journey was spending time in India. And even though I came from a Christian background, but learning meditation and yoga, studying Buddhism, and really gathering some great lessons from these other traditions that I've been written about in a couple of books that I published. But the way that I incorporate it in the workplace is more subtle than that. So I don't talk about those kinds of things, but it comes into our values. And so, in one way, one of the controversies in the US business world over the last few years have been around these initials ESG. And it's the philosophy of what kind of corporate responsibility do us as business leaders have other than making profits? And that it goes to what are the impacts that our businesses have on the broader world around us? So as a real estate company, when we're building buildings, there's obviously environmental effects that we have from an environmental sustainability. The backlash against ESG would tell us we should only focus on profits and how to make the most money. But if we're destroying the environment by making money, there's a real cost to society for that should be taken into account. And from a faith standpoint, when we look at ourselves as being here temporarily and as stewards of the world around us, and my goal is to make money for my investors, but also to make the world a better place. If I'm destroying one part of the world while making another part more money, that just seems disingenuous to me. And so we focus hard as we're doing developments on how can we use technology to make our buildings much more sustainable? How can we use renewable energy like solar rooftops, pioneering new types of concrete mixes that are much lower in carbon than standard? And how do we make our buildings that are more pleasant environments for the workers by having more natural light? And those kinds of things that at the end of the day can both make our investors money, but also not be causing greater harms in the world around us. And because our investors are also large nonprofits, like I said, they're university endowments and foundations, they're coming to understand that the billions of dollars that they're investing, around the world has an impact. And how you invest your money can influence what happens in the broader world.
When you talk about ESG and theology and how those things come together for you, how do you navigate when your view of the world differs than people around you or the leaders that you're working with?
So, one, I try to come from a place of compassion and trying to understand the other side. And that's where I think as I mentioned earlier, over the decades, my EQ, my emotional quotient has gone up of really trying to get in the other person's shoes and be empathetic and compassionate because there are different views. And then, where can we find common ground? And I think so much of it becomes knee-jerk kind of reactions based on politics of what's going on, rather than on the environmental standpoint. I can talk to someone that might be more skeptical, but then you find out, on the one hand, they seem to be a very conservative, someone that might doubt climate change, but they could be an avid hunter or outdoorsman, that we can connect on that standpoint of the importance of preserving the environment. The issue of diversity is very important in our organization. Traditionally, we are one that's a lot of white guys, old white guys that look like me. But, as our world and our international business community and who our tenants are very global, that I need to have people around me that think and look differently than me with different backgrounds, because that just adds more creativity, more voices of ways that we can do better than our competition, and we can come up with more ideas, the more kind of thoughts that you can generate from people with different perspectives. And that's why I've pushed hard here to have a workforce that looks different than we used to look many years ago. And it's created a more dynamic, interesting place for all of us as well, even if it takes sometimes a little bit more time if you're hiring someone that's not coming from the traditional kind of route and may not have as much experience. A very intelligent, creative person, but we might have to put more time into developing them so that they have the experience. But I think at the end of the day, people are realizing, hey, we've got a really great work environment here because we do have these different perspectives.
Niyi, the question I have for you is, when people come into your world that are unfamiliar with the religion and how that shows up for employees, how do you help them navigate through forward thinking and being compassionate, or as you called them, the 5 C's?
Right. So I think fundamentally from an Islamic point of view, and it's something that also shaped my own journey, it's the concept of there's no compulsion in religion, right? Like riveting, which is what the Quran says. And so that is the diversity that Jeff talked about. And I understand fully that there's a difference between spirituality and religiousness and humanity. And it's a journey. And on that journey, we are at different stages. So I'm compassionate enough, I'm open enough to understand that we are all at different levels in that journey. While some are deeply committed, some are just entering into it, etc. And so from that perspective, I welcome all kinds of persons into my world. I embrace different individuals, and I know that it takes time to get committed to a particular cause. And some will also say it's a calling. Some are called and some are not called. And so my own role is to demonstrate good behavior. My own role is to be the role model. And hopefully others will learn from what I do as much as what I say. And I think that's a challenge of leadership, to ensure that what you say is the same with what you do. Many leaders say things that they don't practice. And for me, it's about practicing what you preach. And if you practice what you preach, you walk your talk, others will learn from it.
I love that. Can I pick up on something that Niyi said there? Is the practice which you preach, the walking the walk, that you talk the talk, is what irks me about so much religion is the hypocrisy that we see and the intolerance done under the name of religion. When it's really, the intolerance is coming from an individual and coming from ego. And the idea of wanting to be right, wanting to bend others to one's will, which is exactly the opposite teachings of most of these great faiths. And so it's that piece that I try to remember as I connect with others, of understanding them. And how can you love another as you love yourself without kind of setting yourself aside and setting your ego aside and trying to look at things through their eyes.
I think there's something wonderful about the power of human connection. And you talked earlier about your intelligence versus your emotional IQ. And so does the age and wisdom come with that? Was there a big, as Oprah would call it, aha moment that got you from where you were to where you are to being that that lifelong learner?
It was a long process that I think some of it is age, but we find many elderly people that are difficult and just as stuck in their beliefs. I mean, with me, with me, it was a combination of honestly some personal therapy, having some struggles years ago with my wife when we did some marital therapy. I think everyone should do marital therapy, whether you're married or not. It was one of the greatest things of learning to really see things from other perspectives. It was my own personal spiritual journey, really developing a spiritual practice. You said earlier, there's that distinction between, spirituality and religiousness. And for me, it was developing a daily meditative practice, a mindfulness practice of getting out of my head and getting into my body. And then was interesting is I spent a fair amount, many years studying and practicing kind of Eastern traditions. But I decided at the end of the day, I didn't convert and become a Buddhist. I came back to my own religious tradition of Christianity and then was able to learn and embrace the long, millennial history of Christian mysticism. from a different perspective. So it's been a very long process of education, of spiritual practice, of therapy. And it's not been a linear progression of from being unenlightened to enlightened. It's been up and down, and we all have good and bad days. But, on the overall scheme of things, and I'm continuing to develop, and my wife would tell you I have to be reminded a lot, at different times as well. So
you both have talked about, I think, community and in ways in which you show up as your full self and I think create space for others to do that as well. How would you coach those who aren't as comfortable, right, in creating those communities and spaces for folks to show up as their full selves, knowing that some of those conversations are going to be uncomfortable or people don't know what to ask or what to say? Niyi, do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, thanks. And I think I'll link that to one of the comments from Jeff. Religion should be based on knowledge. I know Jeff has told stories of how he has learned quite a lot, including therapy with his wife and etc., and being a lifelong learner. And I think that really is the key. And so for a leader that wants to be comfortable, you've got to be knowledgeable. You've got to seek knowledge about that which you want to practice. Unfortunately, many are not knowledgeable, but many have half knowledge. There's a lot of unconscious incompetence. But religion has got to be based on knowledge, and it's also got to be based on character. And one of the character is humility. You've got to be humble enough to understand that you don't know everything, right? And once you have that humility, that will allow you be in a position where you can go on the journey of lifelong learning. And you learn from others as much as you're also teaching others. And so for me, I see every opportunity, every interaction as an opportunity to teach, but also an opportunity to learn. And so I will argue that if you really have that learning mindset, you are in the pursuit of knowledge, and if you have that character of humility, of integrity, then all of that will lead you to gain more self-confidence and being able to open up to others, knowing that a mistake is not fatal, but rather is an opportunity to do things better.
As a business leader, as you'll talk through what you've learned, through that learning, there have had to been a ton of mistakes. And I'm wondering, what is something that you've learned from someone else as you've made mistakes, or something that you wish you would have done differently and relied on faith to get you through those things?
I can talk about my mistakes and my struggles, like especially early on, where I didn't grasp the importance of the emotional piece of understanding how people that worked for me felt, not just what their ideas, but how they felt about things. And being in a family business, emotions at that time, I'm not a family business anymore, but at that time, emotions run very high. And it's much more about those relationships and emotions than it is about ideas when you're dealing with family members. And I didn't have that understanding. So by being able to say, like, hey, I made these mistakes when I was a young person thrown into a role with responsibility, and I had to learn from those to be able to talk about that, to be able to stand in front of my company and say, you know what, of all these great education that I've had, marital therapy was the single best thing that made me a better CEO today. But so I think being vulnerable is a key lesson that I had to learn for myself. And then I can teach it, not by telling people that, but by demonstrating, yeah, here's things where I screwed up when I was younger.
So Niyi, do you have a mistake that was a watershed moment or thing that taught you the most that you thought was going to be far more catastrophic than it was?
Plenty. Well, plenty. One of the things I've learned from that really is that the world is full of kind and compassionate people. I've been fortunate to benefit from Allah's forgiveness and from God's forgiveness and blessings. And so the way I've used that in my life is also ask myself, will this be important in 5 years' time? If the mistake will be important in 5 years' time, then I've got to clean it up. But if it's not that significant, I've learned not to take myself too seriously. And like Jeff said, I'm trying to be as vulnerable as I can. And that's part of what you learn in YPO. Being vulnerable, to share with your forum bodies, to share with your peers, so that you can learn from their own journey. And so, I've made tons of mistakes. But I'm thankful and I understand that God is one that forgives and is one that blesses. He loves me and I love him back.
There's a lot of different pieces of this podcast that I've enjoyed, but the vulnerability piece, I think by far has been the most touching, because everybody who has come, every leader that has come on this program has been vulnerable enough to share their story. What I've not asked, what I'm going to ask the two of you is, how do you teach someone to be vulnerable? Because it's not as easy as it sounds. Niyi, we'll start with you.
I demonstrate it. I role model it. I mentor a number of people. And I start by just telling my own stories, my own personal journeys, my failures. To the extent that I open up about those failures and I share the lessons from it, and it has come to improve me and make me a better person, I think that they also understand that it's okay to share. I think the second thing is to create a safe environment. Create a safe and a trusting environment that allows people to be willing to share. And like they say, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? Like we say in YPO forums, nothing, never, no one. So whatever is discussed, whatever is shared with you stays and it's not discussed. So when you create that safe environment, that enables people to trust you, that enables people to be able to share. And I think the tough thing, it's don't be judgmental, right? Don't judge people. Everybody has different journeys, they have different experiences, and we'll react based on our context. What is important is to draw out the lessons, is to draw out the things to work on, to improve upon, and less about who's right or who's wrong. So for me, it's really those three things. Role model it, create a safe environment, and don't be judging. I think the rest flows.
I think that was beautiful, Niyi. And I would just add a couple things. I mean, one, agree 100% with everything that you said, but especially demonstrating vulnerability yourself. You can't just talk about it. You have to show it. It's more of a show, don't tell, because by showing and being vulnerable, it creates yourself as the leader, which is hard to do. It opens up and creates the environment for others to be like, wow, if the CEO can do this, maybe I can too. And so talking about when we make mistakes, and then as he said, not judging, then when others do it. Because as soon as if you start judging someone for they've made a mistake and they've been open about it, you're going to shut that down. And so from our standpoint, is where I can bring this into a practical business application. So as a fund manager, we manage billions of dollars of our investors' money. And they entrust this money because they trust us. And you have one chance to do that right, or you screw it up one time and you ruin that trust, you can't regain that. So I continuously talk here about we are all making mistakes, and we're going to, not just in our personal lives, but we will make mistakes in business. And the key thing is I never punish people for screwing up. That what you have to do is talk about, as soon as the mistake comes up, and we need to talk about it internally. And if it's something that rises to a level that, hey, we're going to have a bad result, we're not always going to make the right investment decisions. And so we talk to our investors. If something is going to go wrong, I want them to know very early that there's a problem. So we're incredibly transparent. And when I think about our fiduciary duties, it is about being open and transparent, because two things can happen if you tell your investors that there's a problem. One, the problem actually happens, but hey, they already know about it and that they know you've been working to fix it. Or two, you tell them and then some time goes by and it actually is not as bad as you think that it is. And you look like heroes because you've been able to head it off. The worst thing that you can do, and where people get in trouble, is you hide the problem. And then it festers and it gets worse and worse until then when it finally comes out, there's no more trust there. It's also how unethical things happen when people think they can cover something up or steal from one area to put it somewhere else and they're going to make it back. And then it continues to compound. So this sense of vulnerability means realizing we're going to make mistakes and talking about it. And then so everyone here knows we're going to make mistakes. And then it's not get upset about the mistake, but what do we learn from it? So how do we learn from this mistake so it doesn't happen again?
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you all. This conversation has been far too quick.
Quick and incredibly insightful. Thank you both for taking time to share with our listeners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
We are Mistakes Over Failures, a podcast by YPO, the global leadership community of extraordinary chief executives.